Right, strap in. We're going deep on this one. Consequentialism. It's a big one, and we're going to get philosophical.
Yeah, this is a really deep dive.
And to make sure we're not just, skimming the surface, we've
Uh-huh.
got some serious source material, excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
So we're not messing around.
Not at all. So the fundamental idea, right at the heart of consequentialism, is that the rightness or wrongness of what you do
Okay.
depends entirely on the consequence.
The outcome.
The outcome. Sounds simple.
On the surface, yeah.
But, there's so much to unpack here.
It's amazing, isn't it, how something that sounds so straightforward can actually lead to these endless philosophical debates? Because then you have to ask, well, which consequences matter?
Yeah.
And what even is a good consequence? We're going to get to all of that, but I think a good place to start is with a classic.
Yeah. Let's go classic. Let's talk utilitarianism.
Okay.
It's almost like, the most famous example of consequentialism.
Right, it's the big one. Everyone's heard of it.
Everyone's heard of it. And when you think of the big names, like Bentham, Mill, all those guys, they were all about the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Right, the greatest good for the greatest number.
But it's not quite as simple as just like making most people happy, right?
No, it's really important to grasp that with classic utilitarianism, the goal is to maximize the total good, not just like a popularity contest. It's about the overall balance, the net amount of happiness and suffering in the world.
Right.
And I think one of the most striking things about utilitarianism is this idea that, in the end, it judges actions solely on those outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So good intentions, promises you made, they don't really have a place in the moral equation.
So, like, if I break a promise, a utilitarian wouldn't care why I broke it. It's all about whether, in the grand scheme of things, that broken promise somehow led to, like, more happiness or less happiness in the world.
Absolutely.
Almost like a moral math problem in a way.
Exactly. You can imagine, like, you promise to meet a friend for coffee, but then you get a chance to volunteer at some event that's going to bring joy to, like, dozens of people.
Oh, okay.
A utilitarian would say, you got to ditch the coffee date, go volunteer, because you're maximizing that happiness, even if it means disappointing your friend.
Right. So it's all about the bigger picture. Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia, they go deep on this, right? They break utilitarianism down into all these categories, like consequentialism, actual consequentialism, direct consequentialism. There's a whole bunch of them.
Oh, yeah, it's a whole family tree.
It really is. It's like they took this one concept and then just, like, exploded it into this whole philosophical universe.
And what's really interesting is that all these pieces, they can kind of stand on their own. And that's where you start to see the really, like, mind-bending parts of consequentialism. Because, believe it or not, philosophers don't even all agree on what the word consequentialism means.
Wait, really? I
Yeah.
thought it was pretty simple. Judge actions by their consequences. Done. Like, what's there to debate?
Well, you see, some philosophers, they insist that for it to be real consequentialism, it has to be what we call agent neutral, which means, like, it doesn't matter who's doing the judging. Whether it's you doing the action or just someone watching, the moral verdict is the same based just on those objective outcomes. But then there are others who want a much broader definition.
So if someone said, like, the right action is whatever increases the number of goats in Texas,
Okay.
that would be consequentialism, even if it sounds totally random.
Technically, yes, because you're still judging actions based on their consequences, even if the consequences are kind of silly.
So are we going to be talking about goat-based morality?
Probably not.
Yeah.
But it shows why it's so important to be clear about what we mean by consequentialism in this deep dive.
Okay, ground rules set, no goats. But let's get back to the heart of it. When we talk about a good consequence, what does that even mean? I mean, the classic utilitarians, they were all about pleasure and pain, right?
Right, they were what we call hedonists. Pleasure is the only good in itself, pain the only bad.
Makes sense.
But then you run into some tricky questions. Like, think about Bentham. He famously said, pushpin is as good as poetry.
Pushpin.
Yeah, it's like a simple kid's game. So how can that be as morally good as a great poem?
It does seem a bit odd to put those two on the same level. How did hedonists deal with that?
Well, some would say it's about the amount of pleasure. A good poem probably brings more people more pleasure than a quick game. It's about intensity, how long it lasts, all those factors. But then, of course, you have Mill coming in with his idea of higher and lower pleasures.
Oh, yeah, like some pleasures are just better, more valuable than others.
Right, but people criticize that too. Is it even really hedonism anymore?
Yeah, where'd you get that extra rule from?
Right, exactly. And then there are objections to all pleasure-based views. Like, what about someone who enjoys hurting others? Is that good just because it brings them pleasure?
Or like that thought experiment, the one where you could plug into a machine and live in this totally blissful simulated reality.
The experience machine.
Yeah, that one. But does that mean it's morally good to just live in a fantasy, even if it feels amazing?
These are the problems with hedonism, and that's why some consequentialists move away from pleasure altogether.
Okay, so what's the alternative?
Well, you could look at desire satisfaction, sometimes called preference utilitarianism. So an action is good if it fulfills the most desires.
Makes sense.
Well,
But how do you measure that? Like, is my desire for pizza as important as someone else's desire for, I don't know, world peace?
right, and what if someone desires something truly awful?
Like more goats in Texas.
Exactly. Even desire satisfaction has its issues.
So it seems like trying to find one thing that's good is complicated.
Yeah, you could say that.
Which brings us to pluralism, right?
Yeah,
The idea that maybe there isn't just one good thing, but many.
you got it. Pluralistic consequentialism says there are many things that are good in themselves. Knowledge, friendship, maybe even beauty or justice.
Okay, I like that. It feels more realistic.
And it solves some problems, like lying. Even if it makes people happy, it undermines truth, which also has value.
So it's not just about the happy feelings.
Exactly.
But then, don't we have a new problem?
Right.
How do you rank all those good things? Is friendship more important than knowledge? How do you even compare them?
That's the million-dollar question. Some say you can't even compare them directly. They're just different.
Like apples and oranges.
Right. And maybe that's why we have these moral dilemmas that just seem impossible to solve sometimes.
Yeah. And what about this? What if instead of trying to add up all these separate good things, we just look at the big picture? Like rank entire worlds based on how good they are overall without getting into all the little details.
It's interesting, like judging a whole painting, not each brushstroke.
Exactly.
It's called holistic consequentialism, or sometimes world utilitarianism.
Okay, so we've got all these different ways of defining what good even means.
Right.
But there's another big practical challenge for consequentialism.
Hmm.
The fact that, well, we can't predict the future. Critics love to point that out. How can you judge actions based on consequences if you don't know what those consequences will be?
It's a fair point, but I think it's based on a misunderstanding. Consequentialists aren't saying you need a crystal ball.
Okay.
The idea isn't that you have to be able to perfectly predict everything. It's more about setting a standard, a way of saying what makes an action morally right, even if we can't always know for sure what the outcome will be.
So it's like the laws of physics determine how a golf ball flies, but golfers don't have to calculate all those forces every time they swing.
Precisely. It's more about the underlying principle, not the practical application.
Okay, I see that. But still, it seems like with morality, things get tricky. What about unintended consequences? Like, what if you do something with the best intentions, but it backfires horribly?
Let's say a woman, Alice, she sees a teenager who's clearly run away from home. They need money to get back, so she buys them a bus ticket. She's trying to help.
Good intentions.
Absolutely.
Right.
But then, tragically, the bus crashes. The teenager dies. Was Alice morally wrong?
Well, if you're just looking at what actually happened, it seems like. Yeah, her action led to a terrible outcome.
It does. But that feels unfair, doesn't it? She couldn't have known.
It's like blaming someone for an earthquake because they dropped a pencil at just the wrong moment.
That's why a lot of consequentialists make a distinction between different types of consequences. There are actual consequences, but also foreseen consequences, foreseeable consequences, intended consequences,
Well,
and so on. You get a whole spectrum of consequentialism, each dealing with that problem of limited knowledge in a different way.
so even if you can't know every consequence, you can still have good reasons to believe some actions are generally wrong.
Absolutely. Like, I think we can all agree that torturing a child is wrong, even if there's some bizarre scenario where it somehow leads to a better world.
All right, right.
We can make judgments based on what we know about human nature, about how things usually work.
Yeah. So it's not just about what actually happens, but also about what you could reasonably expect to happen.
Exactly. Like, imagine a guy, Bob. He makes a burger to share with a friend, forgets to put it in the fridge, it goes bad, the friend gets sick.
Okay. So good intentions, but bad outcome.
Yeah, what? Was Bob morally wrong?
It depends. If you're a strict actual consequentialist, then yes, because the action led to harm.
But if you're looking at it from the standpoint of, like, what he could have reasonably foreseen.
Right. Bob should have known that leaving a burger out would probably make someone sick.
So even though he didn't mean any harm, he was still wrong.
According to that view, yes.
Right.
It all comes down to how much knowledge we can fairly expect someone to have. But this gets even more complex when you start thinking about whose consequences matter. Do we count everyone equally? What about animals, future generations?
Yeah.
You're getting into some of the deepest, most ethically challenging questions in consequentialism. And there's this one thought experiment that really gets at all of this. It's called the transplant scenario.
Oh, I think I've heard of this one. It's the one where you have to imagine sacrificing one person to save five, right? It's the ultimate moral dilemma. Exactly. So imagine you've got five patients, all need organ transplants, and then there's this one perfectly healthy person who just happens to be a match for all of them.
Okay, so purely from a numbers perspective, it seems like the obvious choice is to sacrifice that one person to save the five.
Right.
Like that's maximizing the good.
From a purely numerical standpoint, yes. But I think most people, when they hear that scenario, something inside them just screams no.
It just feels wrong.
And this is where consequentialism bumps up against our gut feelings about justice, about individual rights. Like, can we really just sacrifice one person, even if it means saving more lives?
So are utilitarians supposed to just ignore those feelings and say, well, tough, it's the right thing to do, even if it's morally disturbing?
Some might,
Hmm.
but a lot of them try to reconcile those feelings with the theory. Like, some argue that killing is inherently worse than letting die.
Yes.
So the doctor doing the transplant, they'd be actively killing the healthy person. But if they do nothing, the five patients would die from their illnesses. It's a subtle distinction.
But doesn't that have problems too? Like, what if those five patients were all victims of a crime? Would that make their deaths killings too? And would that then make the transplant okay?
This is where things get really complicated. We have to think about moral responsibility, about what caused the situation in the first place. There's a difference between a doctor directly taking a life and that same doctor failing to prevent a death that someone else caused.
Right. And it makes you think about whose perspective matters most. Like the doctor doing the transplant, they might feel like it's totally wrong, even if someone observing the situation thinks it's the best outcome.
Exactly. So maybe what's good depends on who you are, on your role in the situation.
Right, like maybe what's good for the doctor isn't the same as what's good for the patients or good for society as a whole.
That's the idea behind agent-relative consequentialism. It says those different viewpoints matter.
Okay.
It could also help explain why we feel like we have to keep promises we made personally, or why we care more about our loved ones than strangers.
It's not just a cold calculation, it's about relationships.
Right. But even agent relativity has limits. What if, in that transplant scenario, the doctor was the one who caused those injuries in the first place?
Oh, wow.
Then wouldn't they have a special obligation to try to save those five lives, even if it means making a morally tough choice?
Well, you broke it, you fix it.
Exactly. So agent-relative consequentialism, it can't solve every problem. It makes you wonder if any kind of consequentialism can really capture all the things we feel about responsibility, about blame, about what we owe to people, especially those we've harmed.
So where does this leave us? It feels like we've gone down this deep, winding path, and now I'm not even sure where we are anymore.
Well, some consequentialists try to take a less direct approach. Instead of just looking at the consequences of the action itself, they focus on something related to it,
Okay.
like the motive behind the action.
So it's not just what you do, but why you do it.
Right. That's the idea behind motive consequentialism. And then there's virtue consequentialism, where it's about building good character traits that are likely to lead to good outcomes in general.
So be a good person and good things will follow.
In a way, yes, but probably the most popular indirect approach is what we call rule consequentialism.
Oh yeah, that's the one where you ask, what if everyone did this?
You got it. The idea is that if everyone followed it, would lead to good consequences overall, then it's the right thing to do, even if in a specific case, breaking that rule might seem to have a better outcome.
So in the transplant scenario, a rule consequentialist might say, even if this one transplant seems like it would have good results, it would be terrible to have a rule where doctors could just take organs from anyone.
Precisely. You have to think about the long-term effects of that kind of rule, not just this one instance.
Right. It's like, yeah, maybe it works out this time, but imagine the chaos if that became the norm. Nobody would trust doctors anymore.
Exactly. So rule consequentialism, it tries to bridge that gap between consequentialist thinking and our gut feelings about things like rules and justice and individual rights.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From the very basics of what consequentialism is, to all these variations, all these thought experiments, all these challenges.
That's a lot to think about.
It really is. I think we've given our listeners plenty to ponder for now.
Right.
We'll be back soon to delve even deeper into this fascinating world of consequentialism.
Absolutely. There's much more to explore.
Welcome back. And, diving deeper into consequentialism, something's been kind of bugging me. It's like, how demanding is this whole philosophy, really?
Ah, yeah, that's a good question to ask. It's one that philosophers have spent a lot of time debating, actually.
Because if we're always supposed to be maximizing the good, it seems like, well, aren't we always failing? Like, should I be giving all my extra money to charity instead of, buying new shoes
Hmm.
or spending all my free time volunteering instead of, I don't know, having a life?
Yeah, that's the heart of what we call the demandingness objection. Like, consequentialism just sets the bar impossibly high. It's almost like you can't live a normal life and be truly moral.
Right. It's like you're under this constant moral scrutiny. Every little decision you make, you're thinking, is this creating the absolute maximum good in the universe? I mean, it's exhausting.
To be honest, some consequentialists, like the real hardliners, they might agree with you. They'd say, yeah, most of us are morally failing pretty much all the time. Think of someone like Peter Singer. He argues we should be drastically changing our lifestyles, giving way more to help those in need.
I get that we should be helping others, but to say that every purchase I make, like if it's not directly saving a life, is morally wrong, that just feels extreme. Like, surely buying a cup of coffee isn't evil, even if I could have donated that money instead.
Yeah, a lot of people find that kind of hardline view, well, too hard to swallow. It can make morality feel like this huge burden, like you're always carrying around this weight of guilt. And so, not surprisingly, other consequentialists have tried to find ways to sort of soften that.
Like, didn't Mill have this idea that an action is only morally wrong if it deserves punishment?
Exactly. Mill's point was that if we're constantly punishing people for not donating every spare penny to charity, well, that would probably lead to more unhappiness overall. So maybe it's not morally required after all, even if it's technically the best thing to do.
Okay, so it's about finding some balance, right? Like maximizing the good, but also, having a society where people can actually function without feeling like they're failing some cosmic morality test every second.
Right. And then the rule consequentialists, they offer another way out. They say, look, if the cost of always following some super demanding rule outweighs the benefits, then maybe that rule isn't actually the best one. Imagine if everyone was constantly analyzing every purchase to see if it was maximizing global well-being. I mean, you'd never get anything done.
And this is where I think that idea of agent relative value comes in. Like, maybe it is okay to sometimes prioritize my own well-being because, from my perspective, it matters. It doesn't mean I'm ignoring everyone else's suffering, but it allows for some breathing room in everyday life.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we are individuals, right? We have our own needs and wants. And there are even more radical solutions to this demandingness problem. Some consequentialists say maybe we don't have to aim for the maximum good all the time. Maybe it's enough to just do enough good.
Enough good.
Yeah, it's called satisficing consequentialism.
Okay. So it's like I don't need to have a meltdown trying to decide whether to donate $50 or $100 to charity. I just need to make sure it's a meaningful amount that will actually make a difference.
Exactly. It sets a more reasonable goal. Instead of chasing some impossible ideal, you're just aiming to do enough. And then there's progressive consequentialism, where the focus is on making things better, not necessarily achieving some perfect state of maximum good. It's more about progress, not perfection.
Okay, I like that. Feels more doable, less overwhelming. But here's a thought. What if consequentialism doesn't tell us what's right or wrong at all? What if it's just a way of, like, ranking actions based on how much good they produce? Like, giving $100 to charity is better than giving $10, but neither is inherently right or wrong.
Now you're talking about scalar consequentialism, and it's a pretty big shift from the traditional view. It allows for degrees of rightness, a kind of moral spectrum, instead of just black and white.
It's like consequentialism with a dimmer switch instead of just on or off.
Exactly, but some people would say, well, that takes all the force out of it. If nothing's truly wrong, then what's the point of morality?
Yeah, that's a good point. But maybe it's enough to just have a way of thinking about our choices, comparing them, seeing which ones are likely to lead to a better world. Even if we can't always be perfectly moral, we can at least try to move in the right direction.
I think that's a really pragmatic approach. And honestly, even the most hardcore consequentialist would probably admit that morality isn't simple. We're always dealing with messy situations, weighing different values, never having perfect information.
Right, it's not like we can just plug our choices into some moral calculator and get a definitive answer.
No, not quite. Speaking of imperfect information, I think it's time we revisit that challenge.
You mean the whole problem of actually knowing the consequences of what we do? Because even if we have a perfect definition of good and we know how to rank outcomes, we're still limited by our ability to see into the future.
Right. And that takes us back to all those different types of consequentialism we talked about earlier: actual, foreseen, foreseeable, and so on. Each of those offers a different way of dealing with that uncertainty, with the fact that we can't predict everything.
Let's go back to that woman, Alice, who bought the bus ticket for the runaway teenager.
Okay.
If we're being strict actual consequentialists, then her action was wrong, even though she couldn't have known the bus would crash.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of consequentialists think actual consequentialism is too harsh. It just doesn't seem fair to judge people based on things they couldn't possibly have foreseen.
It's like blaming Christopher Columbus for the Atlantic slave trade. I mean, he had no idea what his voyages would eventually lead to.
Exactly. So foreseen consequentialism, that view would say Alice's action was okay because she didn't foresee the crash. But then foreseeable consequentialism might say she was wrong because a bus crash, well, that's always a possibility, even if she didn't specifically think about it.
So it all depends on how much knowledge we can reasonably expect someone to have at the time.
Exactly. It's not about what they actually knew, but what a reasonable person in that situation should have known.
But even that can get tricky. Like, what if Alice was the one driving the bus? Wouldn't she have a much higher level of responsibility for what happened, even if the crash itself was a total accident?
That's a great point. And that's where this idea of proximate cause comes in.
Proximate cause.
Yeah, it's a legal term, basically meaning the most direct cause of something, even if there's a whole chain of events leading up to it.
So in the bus crash, if Alice was just a passenger, then buying the ticket, maybe that's not seen as a proximate cause of the teenager's death. But if she was the one driving,
Then her actions are much more directly linked to the outcome.
makes sense.
Proximate cause, it helps us figure out which consequences are really relevant when we're judging an action. It's not about blaming, it's about understanding the chain of events and where someone's actions fit in.
Okay, so proximate cause, that's another layer of nuance to all this.
Yeah.
But even with all these refinements, it seems like consequentialism still has some pretty big hurdles to overcome.
I agree. And one of the most common objections is that it just doesn't line up with our gut feelings about what's right and wrong, at least not in every case.
Like that transplant scenario we talked about,
Right.
where consequentialism seems to say it's okay to sacrifice one innocent person to save 5 others. It just feels wrong on a deep level, even if, logically, it leads to a better outcome.
Exactly. And there are other thought experiments that raise similar issues. The classic trolley problem, for example. Do you let a runaway trolley kill 5 people, or do you pull a lever to divert it, knowing it'll kill one person on a different track? Consequentialism says pull the lever, save the most lives. But a lot of people just can't stomach that. It feels different to actively cause someone's death, even if it means saving more lives.
It's like our intuition is screaming at us, don't do it, even if our rational mind says it's the right thing to do.
That's the tension. And it really highlights a fundamental question for consequentialism. Can any theory that's solely focused on consequences really capture the full complexity of our moral experience?
So what do consequentialists say to that? Do they just dismiss our intuition as being wrong?
Some might, but others try to find ways to bring consequentialism more in line with our gut feelings. They might appeal to things like agent relativity or the importance of following rules. A rule consequentialist, for example, might say that having a rule against killing innocent people, even if sometimes breaking it could save lives, that rule will lead to better outcomes in the long run.
Okay, so it's not just about the immediate situation, but about the broader impact of the principles we establish.
Right, and it's important to remember that consequentialism isn't just one thing. There are so many different versions, each with its own focus. Some emphasize pleasure, others have a broader view of what's good. Some go the direct route, others work through rules or virtues. It's a constantly evolving philosophy.
It's trying to grow, trying to address these
Yeah,
challenges. Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to digest.
I think so too.
We've looked at how consequentialism tries to deal with uncertainty, how it tackles that demandingness problem, and even questioned whether it can truly account for all of our moral intuitions.
Oh, we've really dug deep.
We have. And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to shift gears a bit. We're going to look at the arguments for and against consequentialism as a whole. Is it a philosophy that can really hold up, or does it ultimately fall short?
That's the big question, and we'll tackle it head on.
Okay, so we're back, and this is it. the final stretch of our deep dive into consequentialism.
Hmm.
I feel like we've really taken it apart, examined all the pieces, look at how it works, where it struggles. But there's this big question looming out there, and I don't think we've really faced it yet.
You're right. We've been kind of playing defense, right? Explaining how consequentialism deals with all these objections. But we haven't talked about, well, why would anyone actually be a consequentialist? What's the appeal?
Yeah, it can't just be about avoiding criticism. There has to be something about this philosophy that draws people in, that makes it compelling.
I think a lot of consequentialists would say that the basic idea itself, it's just inherently intuitive. Like this notion that we should try to make the world a better place, that we should focus on maximizing good outcomes. I mean, that resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I get that. But plenty of ethical systems claim to be about making the world better. So what makes consequentialism different? What makes it stand out?
One argument is that it offers a really clear, consistent way to approach moral dilemmas. We talked about the trolley problem, right? Where you have to choose between letting 5 people die or actively causing one person's death to save them. And a lot of theories, especially those focused on duties and rights, they kind of struggle to give a straight answer. Consequentialism, though, it's like, well, choose the option that saves more lives. Simple.
But even if it's simple, doesn't it sometimes lead to these conclusions that just feel wrong? Like sacrificing one innocent person to save five. It just doesn't sit right with a lot of people.
I hear you. But some consequentialists would say those gut feelings, those are either just mistaken or maybe they're based on cultural biases, not some universal truth about morality. They'd say, look, if you can save 5 lives at the cost of one, you've got a moral obligation to do it, even if it makes you uncomfortable.
So it's this battle between intuition and what consequentialism says is the most rational choice.
In a way, yeah. But remember, consequentialism comes in many flavors. Some try to take those intuitions into account. Rule consequentialism, for instance, could say we need a rule against killing innocent people, even if, in some cases, breaking that rule would save more lives. It's thinking about the long-term effects of that kind of rule, not just the immediate situation.
We talked about agent relative consequentialism, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which factors in different perspectives. So even if from some objective standpoint, sacrificing one to save five is right, the person actually making that choice, they might experience it very differently.
Exactly. Consequentialism, it has this flexibility. It's not just a rigid set of rules that you apply the same way everywhere. It's more like a framework for thinking about morality, and it can be adapted to different situations.
So more like a toolbox than a rule book.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that's why it's had such an impact, not just in philosophy, but in fields like economics, law, public policy. It gives you a way to think about the consequences of your choices, to try to find solutions that benefit the most people.
That makes sense. But can it really be the basis for all of morality? Like, what about ideas like human rights, the inherent dignity of each person? Do those just disappear when you're doing this consequentialist calculation?
That's a big worry for some people,
Yeah.
but some consequentialists would say, no, actually, those ideas can be supported by consequentialist reasoning, like respecting human rights. That tends to lead to more stable societies, societies where people flourish, and that benefits everyone in the long run.
So even if you don't see rights as these absolute unbreakable things, you can still justify them within a consequentialist system.
Right. And some even argue that a truly just and happy society needs that commitment to individual rights.
Okay, so we've seen some pretty strong arguments in favor of consequentialism. But let's be fair. What about the criticisms? Why do some people reject this whole way of thinking?
Well, we've already touched on some of the main ones. The demandingness problem, how it sometimes clashes with our gut feelings, the whole issue of actually predicting consequences accurately. But there are other critiques too. Some say it reduces everything to this cold, calculating cost-benefit analysis. It takes away the emotion, the personal connections that matter in morality.
Like love, loyalty, those things just don't fit into the equation.
Yeah, critics say consequentialism misses those vital human aspects of morality.
And isn't there a worry that it could lead to injustice, especially for those who can't contribute as much to the overall good? Like, if the goal is just to maximize happiness, couldn't you justify oppressing a minority group if it makes the majority happier?
Absolutely, that's a huge concern. And it's something that consequentialists have to address. Some would say you can combine consequentialism with a really strong commitment to equality, to making sure everyone's interests are taken into account. Others say a truly just society is one that maximizes well-being for everyone, not just the majority.
So it sounds like this debate is far from over.
Definitely not. Consequentialism, it's a powerful tool, but it's not perfect. Like any philosophical idea, it'll keep evolving, it'll keep being challenged.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a pretty thorough look at consequentialism. We've explored its history, the different versions, what makes it strong and what makes it vulnerable. It's a complex, often challenging philosophy, but it grapples with these huge questions about how we should live, how we should make choices.
And that's what philosophy is all about, right? It pushes us to examine our values, to think critically about how we act in the world. There might not be easy answers, but having these conversations, it's vital for anyone who wants to live a more thoughtful, ethical life.
I couldn't agree more. So, to our listeners out there, keep exploring these ideas. What speaks to you? What challenges you? And how can consequentialism, with all its complexities, help you shape your own moral compass? Keep diving deep, and most importantly, keep questioning.